This is an elegant but non-intuitive way to represent negative numbers. In this episode of Bits of Binary, I'll explain how it works here at the House of Hacks. Hi makers, builders, and do-it-yourselfers, Harley here. This is the last planned episode in the Bits of Binary series. Previous episodes explored the concepts of alternate number systems and how to do various mathematical operations in binary. If you missed any of these episodes or want a refresher, they're all in this playlist. In this past episode, I explained how to subtract a smaller number from a larger one. It introduced subtraction and related it with how you know how to do it in decimal. But by limiting the scope to smaller numbers subtracted from larger ones, I avoided the topic of how to deal with negative numbers. Let's look at negative numbers and how computers represent them. When learning decimal in grade school, we started with only positive numbers. Once we got that under our belt, we were introduced to negative numbers, where the number line just mirrored the positive side with a negative sign in front of the number. We could do the same thing with binary, just add a negative sign in front. And if humans were the primary users of binary math, this would probably be sufficient, just like it is in decimal. But we have to remember that the most common use of binary numbers is inside computers. In the digital electronic environment of voltages, currents, and electrons, we don't have the luxury of introducing another abstract symbol like a minus sign. Ultimately, everything has to reduce to an on or off value. Further, because of the physicality of equipment representing numbers of an arbitrary length is hard. So two things are done to simplify the problem for computers to use. First, there are already two symbols, 0 and 1, represented by no voltage and a voltage. Rather than introducing a third symbol, like a minus sign, a 1 is used to represent a minus and a 0 is used to represent a plus. Second, instead of allowing an arbitrary number of digits, a fixed number of digits is defined. Typically, the number of digits are a power of 2, 4, 8, 16, and so forth. For the purposes of example, we'll assume 8 digits. If we assume an unsigned number, 8 digits gives us a range of 0 to 255, or all zeros to all ones. If we use a 1 in the most significant bit to represent a negative number, and a 0 to represent a positive number, we reduce the number of bits for the number by 1 to 7. This gives us a range of 0 to 127. With the last bit for a sign, the total range is minus 127 to plus 127. This introduces some interesting problems. In this scenario, you have 0 to 127 in the positive range, and then you add a 1 to the front for the negative numbers. Look what happens here at 0. You have both a positive 0 and a negative 0. This doesn't make too much sense from a mathematical perspective. The other problem is how to simply handle negative numbers. First, let's look at a decimal example to remember how borrowing works. Let's take 2002 minus 3. We have 2 minus 3. We can't do this, so we try to borrow 1 from the previous column. The previous column is already 0, so we have to borrow from its previous column. Well, this is also 0, so we do it again. This means the 2 changes to a 1, and the third column is now 10. We now borrow the 1, taking the third column to 9 and the second column to 10. Now we can borrow the original 1 we needed, leaving the second column 9 and the first column 12. And now the subtraction can occur with a final value of 1999. Remember how this borrowing against 0 columns causes them to become 9s. We'll come back to this. Let's look at another example of 1 minus 2. According to our earlier rule, we can't take a larger number from a smaller number. So we make a new rule that says if we have a larger number from a smaller number, then swap the order and add a minus sign to the result. We could in theory do this in electronics. Do a comparison, swap the order if needed, and then add the minus sign. And while it can be done, it's pretty complicated circuitry. Let's look at what happens if we try doing some borrowing. Using our example of 1 minus 2, in binary we have 1 minus 1, 0. We can't do this, so we have to borrow from the previous column. But since the previous column is 0, we go to the next column. We do this until we run out of columns. So we set the negative sign and make this last column 1, 0, or the value 2. Now we can borrow 1 from that column, leaving 1, and shift to the next column. This borrowing propagates all the way back, leaving 1s in each column, just like we had 9s in our earlier decimal example. Finally, back to the first column with the borrow, and that subtraction can be done, leaving us 1. Because we have zeros in all the remaining columns, the borrows drop down like the 9s did in our first decimal example. This gives us a final value of 11111111. If we wanted to make this look like the original idea of using the last bit for a sign and the remaining bits look just like their positive counterparts, somehow we need to make this look like 1, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1. We need to figure out how those ones that are a result of borrowing get changed back to zeros. It turns out this is a pretty complicated problem too. But what happens if we just assign the result of all ones to mean -1? Ultimately, numbers are just arbitrary symbols with assigned values. There's nothing stopping us from just saying this symbol represented by all ones has a value of -1. And if we do this, it really simplifies the electronic circuitry for the computer designers. Let's take a look at a couple other examples. Let's take 1 minus 3. In binary, this is 1 minus 1, 1. Going through the process we used for 1 minus 2, we end up with a final result of 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 0, which we assign the value of -2. Now let's take 1 minus 4. In the binary, this is 1 minus 1, 0, 0. Again, going through the process, we end with the final result of 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 0, 1, which we assign the meaning of -3. Doing this again for 1 minus 5 gives us the value 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 0, 0, meaning -4. Is there a pattern emerging? If we change all the ones to zeros and zeros to ones, we see this. And this is the positive value offset by 1. So there is a pattern, and it's pretty logical. And it turns out doing this offset by 1 and changing zeros to ones and ones to zeros is relatively easy to do in electronic circuitry. It's called 2's complement and has become the standard way of representing negative numbers. Going back to our school days learning decimal numbers, once we learned about negative numbers, we then learned that all subtraction problems can be transformed into problems where we add the opposite. So 2 minus 1 becomes 2 plus -1, and 1 minus 2 becomes 1 plus -2. Well, the same thing happens in binary using 2's complement notation for negative numbers. 2 minus 1 becomes 2 plus -1. Working through this, 0 plus 1 is 1, 1 plus 1 is 0, carrying a 1. This 1 plus 1 continues until we run out of digits, leaving us with 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, the expected answer. If we switch the operands, we have a 1 minus 2. Converting this to adding the opposite gives us this. Working through this, 1 plus 0 is 1. The remaining columns are all 0 plus 1, giving us 1s, for the final result of 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, or -1. Again, the expected answer. And it turns out this works for any combination of numbers. Let's look at this on a number line. And remember that weird case we had before with a positive 0 and a negative 0? Well, it turns out with 2's complement math, what used to be that hard to deal with -0 just becomes -128. Here at the House of Hacks, I hope to inspire, educate, and encourage people with a bent toward making things with a mechanical or technical bent out of wood, metal, cameras, and electronics. Binary is the basis for many things related to digital electronics, as well as Boolean algebra, which I'll cover in a future series. If topics such as these are interesting to you, be sure to subscribe and click the bell notification icon to have YouTube alert you when future videos are uploaded. Thanks for joining me on our creative journey. Until next time, go make something. Perfection's not required, fun is.